I was so busy and preoccupied hiking out in the woods that day. I can't believe that I had the encounter that I did. Walking along the trail that I was on, it was a beautiful, serene sight, surrounded by tall redwoods on both sides, with a foresty expanse that seemed to go on forever. I had my backpack, my canteen, and nothing was going to stop me from the 6-mile trail loop. I had just gone through a really bad relationship, and I really needed some fresh air and some nature to kind of help cheer me up. The first thing I noticed, and I've gone on this trail before, is that it's usually quite busy, especially right around 10 a.m. People walking their dogs, other friendly hikers passing by, saying hello, waving, but it seemed kind of dead. This was a nice, beautiful morning in May. It should be booming, but I didn't think much of it. I just figured, hey, I have the trail all to myself. So I continued on at a good pace. There's a point in the trail where it kind of slopes down a bit, levels out, and then goes back up. So as I'm going down the slope, I hear noise off to my left, and I look, thinking somebody's in the woods. Maybe another hiker or somebody else walking their dog, potentially. And I look, nobody's there. I just immediately think it was probably a bird that landed or something. I mean, after all, these are the woods, and I can't put past any animals to be around. So I hardly even stopped, just kept on walking. But as I'm walking, I began to get this sensation that somebody is following me. So just like in the movies, I keep turning my head, expecting to hear leaves crunch or twigs to break, but nothing. In fact, the opposite happened. The forest that was alive around me, and birds, and the wind, and you can kind of just hear the forest. It was eerily silent, kind of like I walked into Silent Hill, just deathly quiet. I didn't notice this right away, but more noticed it after time, after I had reached the bottom of the slope. I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable, but not totally afraid yet. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see somebody peering out behind a tree, watching me. But of course I saw nothing. I just thought nothing of it, and continued on my way, thinking that whatever was happening was very weird, but wasn't completely off-putting. At least, not just yet. So, I'm continuing my hike, and there becomes a large bend on the trail, and then it continues back straight. So I come around the bend, continue going on, and then there's a small little bridge, actually 2 small little bridges, that cross this small section of river. As I'm going across these bridges, I could have sworn to you, out of the right side of my eye, I saw a white face looking at me. So I turned to look, and I saw nothing. From what I saw out of the corner of my eye, it was an elongated face, and very hairy, but white. But when I turned, there was nothing there. So now I'm thinking, alright, this is getting weird. I feel like somebody is definitely trying to pull a prank. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to pick up the pace, finish this trail loop, and I'm done. So I picked up the pace even faster. And the further I went into this trail loop, which, by the way, still not seeing a soul around, things began to get even more creepy. It stayed completely silent this entire time, besides, of course, the sound of water and the river. And as I make it far enough away from the river, to where the sound of rushing water is barely audible, I began to hear something very large coming directly towards me, not just walking casually, but running. It sounded like a grizzly bear charging at me at full speed, and I'm looking around, surrounded by open forest and redwoods. If there was anything coming at me, with the sound that this thing had, you would see it, but I saw nothing, and I could hear it charging at me through the forest. Panic immediately set in, and I bolted as fast as I can. I'm no athletic runner. In fact, I probably couldn't even handle a marathon, but my adrenaline allowed me to run at least 1 to 2 miles straight. And yeah, my sides were killing me. Now, I was about halfway, probably a little over halfway into the trail loop, thinking that I had no other choice but to finish it out, since I was already here, and turning around now could mean sudden death. if what I was happening to deal with was hostile and dangerous. At this point in my trek, I did not feel safe. I was feeling hunted by something. Some large animal had me in for its dinner plate, and I did not want to be included. So I just walked a very fast pace after spending about 20 seconds trying to catch my breath. Fear drove me. Fear allowed me to push my physical limits and finish the trail loop in the amount of time that I've never done before. The entire time, deathly silent. Something around me. I could feel it. Something was not only following me, but watching me. And I never saw anything else besides that one face that I saw while crossing the river way back earlier on in the trail loop. However, as I got to the last mile of the loop, things really got out of hand. Not far off in the woods around me, and not to my left or right, but all around me. The forest came alive with these horrible growls and screams. It sounded like an animal getting hurt. Like, can you imagine the scream that a coyote, for example, would make if he got stuck in a bear trap? This howling scream of pain mixed that sound of pain with anger and deepened it quite a bit. And that's kind of what I heard all around me. There was multiple of whatever was making this. Now I knew for a fact there was some sort of animal following me, or animals, and I knew I had to quickly finish this trail loop, or else who knows what would have happened. The noises continued to go on and off, along with the rest of the forest being totally silent. After finishing the trail loop, nobody else was in the parking lot, which, again, incredibly weird and not normal. I made it to my car, the sound still completely silent, got in my car and I drove off. I've not been back to that trailhead since, and that was May of last year. I've posted my story online in a couple places, but haven't really gotten adequate feedback yet, or at least anything that would help me point in a concrete direction of what it could have been. Somebody had mentioned Bigfoot. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I do believe something happened. So maybe you can kind of help me understand what I went through, and maybe if there truly was some sort of unknown animal following me and stalking me. Hopefully, it did not plan to eat me. Not a monster sighting at all, but I saw something that I cannot explain what it was. When I was 17 and living with my father, he had a good amount of property and had a barn all the way out back. Beyond that is fencing, and for whatever reason, the old owners, before they put the fencing around the property line and the tree line, they had this kind of old, well, it wasn't a rundown shed at the time, but beyond the fencing into the wood line, there's this little maybe 10 by 10 shed, used for storing various tools and supplies. My father, for whatever reason, even after storing stuff in the barn and putting up fencing around the entire property, still insisted on putting supplies in there, when we had ample room in the barn. Why, I'm not exactly sure. So, my father always made me the fetch boy. Anytime he needed specific tools, even though he didn't use them that rarely, which is why I think he put them in there, he would have me go out past the barn, over the fencing, out about 30 or 40 meters into the woods, to the shed. It was completely out of the way, and there wasn't even a gate or anything. I had to climb over the fence, which was a small wooden fence, and then walk roughly 40 meters to get into the shed, which was padlocked, and would require a special key that my dad gave me. While it was a complete pain and inconvenience to walk all the way out there, it also gave me the creeps. I'm not gonna lie. You're surrounded by woods. Pretty dense woods, mind you. I always had the same feeling every time I was over in the shed grabbing stuff, that I was very vulnerable. That something, at any given moment, could reach out and grab me if it wanted to. I've never been a believer in monsters or Bigfoot, or anything that's a supposed hoax, but there's just something around that shed. I don't know. I can't put words to it. It made me very uncomfortable. And so every time my father would call me to fetch supplies from the shed, I would dread it. But I respect my father and I love him, so I did what I was supposed to do. He had purchased this entire plot of land when I was roughly 13, with his inheritance money. Shortly after that, when I was around 15, he really began trying to clean up the property, installing a nice fence, really using the barn, and keeping the shed all the way out back there for tools that he would only need for special occasions, keeping his main tools and his every now and then tools separated. That's enough background info. This was wintertime, and I remember because it had snowed. Not a heavy snowfall, but maybe a foot. Enough that there could be visible tracks in the snow. From me, leading out to the house, past the barn, up to the fence, climbing over the fence, and up to the shed. As I'm approaching the shed, it's completely silent, which isn't exactly uncommon in the wintertime. I unlock the shed, grab the few tools my dad needs, lock it back up, and I walk out, feeling incredibly creeped out. More so than usual. It felt like there was something around, but I tried to pay no attention to it and get back to my father, due to his poor patience. I did not want to make him mad. The day goes on, and my father requests that I go take the tools back and store them safely. So, it's now getting to be about evening time. The sun is just starting to set in the sky, so it's not dark or anything yet, but it will be soon. So I'm making my way back, and as I get to the fence, I could just sense deep down in my gut, something isn't right. Have you ever had that feeling? Or maybe you've been in a situation where your gut instinct is telling you, don't go further, don't do this, don't do that. Danger, imminent danger. That's immediately what I felt. And my first thought was, maybe there's a mama bear around with her cubs. Or maybe there's a cougar. You never know in these parts. Even more so considering all around me is very densely packed woods. And in the dead of winter time, without all the leaves, the brush was still thick, with bramble, dead bramble, trees, and everything else. Something could easily be hiding in there. But, not wanting to make my father angry, I decided to push my feelings aside and press on. These things needed to be put away, and he would be furious if I left his tools out for any reason. So I climbed over the fence, with the tools still in my hand, walked up to the shed. Now, as I'm walking up to the shed, I'm roughly maybe 10 meters. I hear something to my 2 o'clock come running at me through the woods. It sounded big. Imagine a silverback gorilla, or a rhinoceros, something of incredible size that is also bipedal, come charging at you. I'm in mid-stride, probably now about 5 meters from the shed, about to pull the key out of my pocket, when this thing breaks out of the brush, probably no more than 15 or 20 feet away from me. And this thing that I've never seen before in my life looks me directly in my eyes, and it looks pissed that I'm there. In that very moment, I felt my entire life flash before my eyes. I just knew I was a goner. Without even thinking, just reacting, I threw down the tools, turned around and ran, which I know is the worst thing you could possibly do, dealing with any unknown predator, because things like to give chase. I don't know if this thing ran after me. I just booked it, flying over the fence, and going as fast as I can, not checking if this thing ran behind me. My dad, who was outside the house, putting some of his stuff away, looked at me, and wondered what was wrong. Asked me why I was scared, since I probably wore it pretty well on my face, and I was stuttering really bad, telling him what I just saw. He immediately got angry, thought I was just trying to be lazy and not put away his stuff. He cut me off mid-sentence, demanding I go back there, finish the job that I was told to do, and put away things properly. He did not want to hear it, and in my teenage frustration, I felt desperate, not sure what to do. So I stood there for a moment, and I slowly walked back. You have to understand that in that moment, I really had no options. He was looking at me the entire time, making sure I go back and take care of the tools. But also, where he is on the side of the house that he's on, he can look and see the direction that I'm going, but he can't see beyond the fence. And once you cross over the fence, the woods are dense enough, even in winter, that you can't see the shed because of where it's tucked in at. I'm walking as slow as possible, dragging my feet, just anticipating this thing jumping out over the fence, going to grab me and kill me. I'm completely unarmed. I have nothing. Maybe a pocket knife in my back pocket. So I'm slowly making my way up to the fence, and just like before, it's completely quiet, void of any noise or sounds. I slowly climb over the fence, and make my way very slowly, trying to be as quiet as I can to the shed. I figured, in my moment of desperation, if I had the key pulled out, I could quickly walk up to the shed, being as quiet and stealthy as possible, grabbing the tools on the ground, which I could see, and quietly putting them in the shed, quietly locking it, turning and booking it out of there, and hopefully, whatever it is that I saw would not be around. Now, I begin my slow ascent towards the shed, Skyrim sneak style. I'm crouched, being as quiet and stealthy as I can, and as I get to about 10 meters from the shed, like I was before, I look over to where this thing barreled through the woods, and I could see all the snow that was disturbed from where it landed. And to my horror, I look, and I could see that once I had ran away, or who knows how long after, it escaped behind the shed. That's where the disturbed snow and tracks seem to lead, which means it's either hiding behind the shed, or it's in the woods close by. I was even more terrified now, my heart beating out of my throat, my hands sweaty. I quickly fumble the key, quickly grab the supplies off the ground, unlock the padlock, tear it off, open the door, and I don't even bother to gently set the tools in. I kind of just quietly toss them in. I'd figured my dad wouldn't notice, and I would just deal with it later. I quickly relock the padlock, and I turn around, and without wasting a second, I begin to run. But before I could even lift a leg to start running, I hear the nastiest, most guttural growl I've ever heard in my life. And it came from right behind the shed, right in the little patch of woods. I bolted out of there, jumping over the fence, and running back to my dad. I didn't even bother telling him anything. I just told him the tools are away and all is good. That was pretty much the end of that. The rest of the time that I lived there, I never experienced anything like that again, so I have no idea what it was I saw that day. But believe me when I say that I had to go back to that shed multiple times since then, including the following winter, and all the way up until I graduated high school, when I would turn 18, and I finally moved out of there to go live with some roommates in the city. Before I end this, I want to include more details on what this thing did and what it looked like. The first time, as I'm standing there, about 10 meters away from the shed, and this thing jumps out of the woods, onto the snow. It kind of just looks at me, looks angry that I saw it, but more kind of just staring me down. It was like a mixture of emotion on its face, a cross between sizing me up, angry that I was there, and like it was plotting or planning on what its next move was. It was terrifying looking, I'm not gonna lie. But after looking into its eyes, I knew that it was also highly intelligent, and this wasn't some wild animal. It had a massive, woolly, hairy body, covered in thick brown hair, legs just like a man. I couldn't see its feet or the bottom parts of its legs. It was buried in snow. It had really long, woolly, thick arms, massive hands like a person, with long, dangly claws, and its face was elongated, kind of like a dog, but it did not look canine at all. It had large fangs and teeth sticking out of its mouth, from its bottom jaw and its top jaw. It had sunken-in eyes that were set on the sides of its skull, and these long horns that would shoot from the top of its head, off in a kind of a spiraling direction. Not like a ram or goat, but they kind of angled off. They actually resembled that of gazelle horns, where they kind of angle up, but kind of twist and bend. They were also black. Whatever this monster was, looked like something straight out of my own nightmares, and was enough to make me frozen in the second. There was no thinking. It was fight or flight, do or die. And if I made the wrong choice, I could have died. I had no hesitations that this thing wouldn't kill me if it wanted to. I'm not sure why it jumped out at me, or if it heard me coming, or what. But it did seem to be surprised that I was there, like it wouldn't expect me to be there. And when it went behind the shed, maybe it was waiting for the right moment to attack me, or to lure me back there and eat me. I don't know. But as I told you, I never saw it again after that. That was the end of it. My father, of course, never believed me, even though I had told him and reiterated the story to him multiple times. He just still is convinced I was trying to be lazy and get out of putting the tools away, even though I've done a lot of work with my father, and never once have I acted like that. He's just a hard old fart. It's really driving me crazy that I can't find out exactly what I saw. It wasn't a Bigfoot, was certainly not a Dogman, and I don't think it was a Skinwalker. I tried to hop on Google Images and see if there's any creature that could come close to what I possibly saw, to maybe help identify a specific cryptid that would help narrow it down. Well, the closest I found was if you Google sheep squatch, and it's a creature that looks similar to what I saw. Not at all the same though. If you Google it, you'll find a creature that has ram-like horns, a very sunken-in face with a lot of sharp, tiny teeth, and hooves on its feet. While there is a resemblance, and it's the closest of what looked like what I saw, it's not exactly. The body was pretty spot on in this image. Very thick woolly hair, very brown, but the hands are different. Even though they're human hands, they had long, thick black claws at the end of each fingertip. It looked very abnormal looking. The arms were a little bit longer. The legs, just like the body and arms, very thick, very muscular, very oversized. And the head looked similar, but not at all like the picture. It was more elongated, not set in like the creature displayed, and it had more of a mouth and face like a canine, but didn't look canine, if that makes sense. The eyes were more sunken in, were more pronounced, and the horns were not at all white or curled back like a ram's horns. They were more like a gazelle, like I said, and twisted and gnarled and pointed upwards, and were black. The teeth also weren't like that in the picture. They weren't tiny and sharp. They were large and looked more like dinosaur teeth, to be honest with you, than anything else. Something you truly expect to see on a monster. I'm truly grateful that my father, to my knowledge, never had to see it or deal with it, and that was the last time that I ever saw it myself. Oh, and one last thing. A few months after I moved away, he actually ended up having that shed torn down and rebuilt a new one about probably 40 feet away from the house, closer to the barn, but closer to the house, so he could access his tools easier. I wonder why he didn't just do that initially. A very terrifying night I had, back years ago, when I was backpacking by myself around Twin Falls, Idaho, in the woods, not another soul around for miles. I was completely isolated and alone. I'm also very aware and knowledgeable about the wildlife of the area that I'm stepping into, so I didn't go into this unprepared or ignorant. I had bear mace, a knife, even a 9mm, just in case. You can never be too sure out here. This would have been probably my third night. Everything was very normal. Keep in mind, though, that I'm the only soul around for miles. I'm up in the mountains, and there's no reason there should be anybody out here. So, I turn in for the night, and I wake up, sometime in the early morning hours, to this deep, heavy breathing. Imagine somebody the size of a giant, and who's also been a lifetime smoker. It almost had a deep wheeze quality every time the breath exhaled. I froze right in my sleeping bag, thinking there's somebody here outside my tent, looking for something. It stood there for what felt like forever, just stayed there stationary, heavy breathing. Then it began moving around my tent, knocking over supplies, throwing all my stuff around, grunting, and making a very heavy noise. Every time it took a step on the ground, I could tell this was not a person. It was incredibly heavy. It kind of just took its time, making its way around my camp, and at one point, got really up close to my tent, even grabbed a hold of the zipper, and was messing around with it. Pulled it down about halfway, slowly, like it was going to go into my tent. I was petrified, and then it just stopped, and everything became completely silent. I lay there for about another hour, didn't hear anything, expecting this thing to either rip the door open and charge in and grab me, or just nothing. I eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, and was jolted awake by my instant memories of what happened. I shot up, grabbed my firearm, and ran outside, being very aware of my surroundings. The sun was now up, and my campsite was trashed. All my supplies were thrown everywhere. Stuff was torn up. My tent was left alone. And this horrible odor lingered in the air. It smelled like a mix between a rotting carcass that had been sitting in the sun for days on end, so rotting nasty meat, wet dog, and this awful skunky odor. It was incredibly musty, the most musty I've ever smelt in my life. It was so much so that it was overpowering to the point to where it made me gag. The smell was all around my campsite. I cut my losses right there, packed up everything, and headed back towards civilization, to where I felt safe, and around animals and creatures and nature that I was familiar with. What was supposed to be a 7-day hike out in the Idaho mountains by myself ended up only being about 3 or 4 days. It probably saved my life. My grandfather is full native and is from the Choctaw tribe. He actually has a ton of scary stories from growing up around the res, but one that I'll share with you today is when he was about 13 or 14. He was out with his father doing something in the woods, probably gathering firewood, if I can remember right, when he says that he felt something watching him. He brushed it off, continued splitting wood, I believe, and when he finally looked over and stopped ignoring his senses, he sees this massive head sticking out of the thicket with large horns staring at him. The words he used to describe it were scary and ugly, and said that it had really nasty sharp teeth, like they were yellow and rotten, with bits of black all over them. Said the eyes were a very dull yellow, and had very tiny black pupils. It really scared my grandfather for a long time, but he had already had run-ins with the paranormal, aliens, supposedly, and all other sorts of crazy paranormal happenings where he was living. So this was really just another branch on the tree, so to speak. I had tried doing some research to see if I can find any Native American folklore or legend that fits the description of what he gave me, but the only thing I could come across was Goatman, and I don't think that's what he saw. He also explained that whatever this thing was, poking its head through the thick brush, it was very tall, well over 8 or 9 feet, and that the head was incredibly massive. I think he just thought it was some sort of demon coming for him. His father, also being a believer, you might say superstitious, whatever you want to call it. My grandfather told his father, my great-grandfather, they didn't waste any time. They got in the truck and they left. Before I go, another crazy story from my grandfather. When he was about 18, 19, or 20, it was in the fall, and he was tracking this really large buck. He came to this spot in the woods where he had good eyes on it, and as he got ready to make the shot, this large, Bigfoot-like creature comes out of nowhere, grabs the buck by the neck, twists and breaks its neck like it was a small bird, virtually effortlessly, then just grabs the buck by the back legs, throws it over its shoulder, and casually walks off. Scared my grandfather pretty badly too. He took off. My grandfather's tribe, the Choctaw people, have a name that they call these Bigfoot creatures, but forgive me, because I can't remember it at the moment, but he knows what he saw. He has also seen them growing up, so he knew what it was. I'll reach out to him and see if I can't get him to document or write down a bunch of his experiences and encounters. I think you would really appreciate them, and if anything, really enjoy them. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Have a wonderful day. I spoke with this witness on January 8th, 2006, for more than 40 minutes. This man and his wife were returning from a trip from Florence, Alabama. They were watching the sun set as they drove along the Trace Parkway in a generally southwestern direction. They had just crossed the Mississippi-Alabama state line and had traveled approximately 3 to 4 miles into Mississippi as they approached mile marker 307. The witness said that he saw what initially appeared to be a person jogging along the right side of the road in a southwestern direction. He emphasized that it's fairly common to see joggers along the trace, so he didn't think too much about it at first glance. The witness said that when approaching that mile marker, the road is hilly, and there's a slight downhill incline at that point. At the bottom of the hill, the road curves to the right when traveling southwest on the trace. There was a vehicle approaching in the opposite direction and was just entering the witness's field of vision as he topped the hill just prior to mile marker 307. The vehicle traveling in the opposite direction had also just topped the hill as well. As both vehicles came into view of each other on tops of their respective hills, the animal appeared to panic. Both cars traveled down their hills, around the curve, and past each other. The witness slowed to nearly a stop, while the other car appeared to pass by without slowing at all. The animal was initially traveling at a normal speed for a jogger when he first noticed it, but then it suddenly began moving quickly and appeared to be running at about the speed a deer would sprint as both vehicles entered the curve. As it crossed the road from right to left, it lost its balance and tipped, nearly falling down. After catching its balance, it bounded off into the woods. It had its back towards the him until it turned across the road. The closest he came to it was roughly 25 to 30 yards, and it ran between the two cars, and roughly equal distance between the vehicles. He said it was solid black, and was even illuminated by the sun, which was still in the sky at this point. He said the entire observation lasted only a matter of seconds, and his full attention was focused on it for roughly 2. It happened so quickly that he didn't even have the time to say look to his wife, who was also in the car with him. He thinks the sighting took place with the bounds of Tishomingo State Park. He emphasized that he did not pay much attention to it until it panicked and began moving very quickly. He got a side profile of it as it crossed. He said its head did not look human and appeared to be a little raised in the back and appeared to slope towards the front. He described it as very stocky with a muscular build. When it tripped, it swung its arms out to catch its balance. He said the hands appeared to be much larger, proportionally than a human's, and the arms appearing to be longer, proportionally than a normal human arm. While the animal was running along the highway, the arms were up like a human, just like they would be when jogging. The surrounding terrain is steep hills and large boulders. Bear Creek even runs through here. An area adjacent to this location is called the Freedom Hills. It's called that because it was a favored hiding area for escaped slaves prior to the Civil War. It's very possible a large wild beast might be roaming through this area that resembles that of what they call a Bigfoot. My mother and I had taken my young Doberman to the Honey Island swamp to let him run and get some exercise. We had driven to the end of the road where the bridge had collapsed and you could not go any further back by car. The area is just a few miles from the Honey Island exit, off of Interstate 59 in Mississippi. The road was built up, about 8 feet from the ground, since it flooded back there. The area around the road was swampy, having lots of trees. The ground was covered in leaves, since it was fall. We had been there about 10 minutes, and my dog had pretty much been staying on the road as he ran around. I went to get something out of the car, and when I began walking back to where my mother was on the road, she was looking out into the wooded area at something. She pointed out what appeared to be something dark beside a large cypress tree. We could not make out a head, but it appeared to be gray and black, covered in fur, and was actually a torso. Whatever we were looking at was large. It stood above some bushes, and the top part was behind the branches of the tree. It had to have been well over 6 feet tall, since the bushes were at least 3 feet tall. It definitely was not another tree, because the texture was so different, and the big tree next to it looked different. It was approximately 1 p.m. The sun was bright. The light was dappled through the tree cover, but we could see that it was shining off of what appeared to be hair, or something with a wiry, hairy texture. It even seemed to shift back and forth, as if you were to shift your weight from one leg to another. If I had to guess, it was probably 50 to 75 feet away from us. We could not get a real good look at it. We did not hear or smell anything, and my dog did not seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. After looking at it for at least 2 to 3 minutes, we got very uncomfortable. We decided that we would drive a mile or so up past one of the bridges on the way back to the interstate. We put my dog in the car and drove at least a mile up the road before we stopped again to let my dog back out. We had been there approximately 5 minutes when we heard footsteps in the woods. We could hear them getting closer. This time, my dog picked up on the sound and became alert. We could hear it. We could hear it stop, then move forward a few steps a couple of times. We couldn't see anything, but my dog was definitely trying to figure out what he was hearing. We got a little scared, so we loaded up again, and this time drove up to where there were some nature trails and a shooting range, probably at least 2 miles up the road. We got out of the car again, and were not there for 2 minutes when we heard what sounded like something running through the woods toward us. At that point, my dog got so terrified that he ran back to the car and hit the closed door, just trying to get back in. My mother and I ran to the car. All 3 of us got out there as fast as we could. We never saw what was making the noise in the woods, but whatever it was big enough to make a lot of noise, both walking and especially running. After leaving and having major discussion about what had happened, my mother and I got our nerve up to go back to the end of the road later that day. So now it's about 4 p.m., and we wanted to see what we had seen earlier, if it was still there. When we got there, we could not find what we had seen before. We saw what we were pretty sure was the big tree, but we did not see what was by it originally, and we were not brave enough to go down into the wooded area for a closer inspection. We basically left with even more questions than we started out with. We never had a clear view of what we saw, but what we heard definitely scared us. Also, before I forget, I once met a girl that told me that her family used to actually camp in the Honey Island swamp, and that something came up one night while they were sitting around the campfire. She said that her dad and uncle scared it off by shooting guns in the air, but not before one of her family members managed to get a couple of pictures of it. She said they weren't very clear, but that you can definitely tell there was something there. She said that they had sent them to LSU for them to review. I do not know her name. I only met her once. She told me about this at least 5 years before even my experience took place. I had went and hung a stand on a tree the day before hunting deer in an area north of Sardis Lake on public land. I knew I was the only person in there because the trails hadn't been used for some time. I rode in about 2 miles and then walked roughly 300 yards to where I had hung my climber. It was just about daybreak. I was 20 or so feet up a pine tree when I heard what sounded like somebody beating a large stick against a tree. A ways away, I spotted some movement in the area. It's where the sound came from. Whatever it was very brown and tall. My first thinking was it was a bear. So, using my binoculars, it was about 200 yards from me and dawn. So I pulled up my rifle to look through the scope, hoping I could see it better. It wasn't a bear. It did not have ears on top of its head, and its face was flat. It was at least 8 feet tall, and stood just like a man. I noticed the skin was a grayish green, and the hair was thin. It was so startled, I stood up. It turned toward my direction, and knew I was there. It leaned its head back as if it were smelling the air, then took off. It moved 40 or so yards in a few seconds and was gone. I was shaking badly, climbed straight down. I could not believe what I had seen, so I started walking in the direction that I had seen it. I walked over to a hill where it had slid and left a track. It was human-looking, the foot track. This scared me because I was trying to tell myself it was just a bear. Then, a sound came from the woods that sounded just like a whoop. I hurried back, got my stand, and left those woods. That has been 6 years ago now. Every time I told anybody my story, they made fun of me. So I've been reserved about letting anybody know. But recently, a friend of mine had an encounter he does not want to let anybody know about. He thinks people will think he's crazy. So I found the BFRO, and amazed by how many people have seen the same things I have. When I was 8 or 9 years old, my sister, some friends, and I were swimming in a small watering hole, more like a wide spot in a creek, behind the military housing, probably 400 yards into the woods. I wasn't swimming. I was sitting down at the side of the water hole with my feet in the water, but kind of drawn up beside me, and my sister was sitting between my legs in the water. We were all just playing around, being pretty loud, and I don't know if I had heard something. I caught some movement out of the corner of my eye. My attention was drawn to a large bush on the other side of the swimming hole. I sat there, staring at this bush for a good 30 to 40 seconds, maybe a full minute, before I realized what it was that I was seeing. There was a face looking at me from between and behind some branches. It was very flat, very big, dark brown, almost black. The eyes were black. I thought at the time the eyes were looking at me with curiosity or amusement. It did not look evil, menacing, or, well, you know. I don't remember a mouth or nose. I remember the hands being huge, gigantic, the size of baseball mittens. It seemed like I was looking at it for longer than more just minutes, but it could not have been that long. And all of a sudden, I was just terrified. I picked up my sister and, screaming, ran out of there. Everybody just followed me out. I was the only one who saw it. My friends wanted to know why I was so scared. I told them it was Old Man Walker, which, by the way, is a hermit who supposedly lived way back in the woods and would even shoot at you if he saw you. They were okay with that. I didn't want to believe what I saw, but it definitely was not human, and it was not an old man. I found it very comforting to know I was not the only one to have ever seen something so frightening. Thinking about my encounter, I was in no way threatened, and I don't know why I was so frightened, but I still wake up to this day with nightmares. That face was scary. Back in 2011, all the way up until 2014, I used to work as a 911 phone operator, and while I handled many disturbing phone calls, everything from emergencies to potential suicide, and even worse, everything you can imagine, there was always one that stuck out to me. For the sake of safety, I won't be mentioning the name of the county that I worked for, but I will say that it was in Southern California, in a rather large populated city you probably know about. That's all I'll say about that. The phone call in question was picked up around 12:32 a.m. by a woman who sounded to be around in her 50s. She was complaining that a large, upright, lizard-like person was trying to break into her house. I had sent dispatch to go check it out, but before that even happened, she ended up hanging up on me. And before she ended up hanging up, I heard glass breaking in the background and her screaming. And before that, she was claiming it was trying to get in. When I'd asked her to describe to me the person, she kept saying, "This isn't a person in a costume. This is something from hell. After this thing or person broke into the house, and you could hear the glass shatter, she screamed, and I lost the signal. I got in contact with the officer who arrived at the scene. The lady was missing, and there was a weird green-blue substance all over the side of her wall where the broken window was, leading out behind her house, and then just suddenly vanished. Is it possible that whoever or whatever this was had kidnapped her and taken her? But where? It's something that still haunts me, even as an individual who wasn't even actively on the case. I'm sorry for my story being so short, but that's all the details I have, and I thought it fit well within your realm of storytelling. Take care. After being recently divorced, me and my dog found a nice little place to stay with a beautiful backyard and a nice little creek running behind it, with some woods and swamp beyond that. The house itself is a pretty small place. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, maybe 1,200 square feet at best. It doesn't provide a lot, but it's more than enough for me and my dog. I wouldn't exactly say I live out in the country, but I don't also live in a little suburban neighborhood either. I'm kind of tucked away, not too far from town, but just perfect. You know, the Goldilocks zone. Besides the strange things going on around here, it's actually a pretty beautiful place to live. I get all 4 seasons. The weather and the temperature is pretty moderate, at least what I'm used to. And my favorite part of all, it's quiet. Now that I cleared up all the necessary background info, let's get to the weird stuff that's been happening around here. Like I just mentioned to you, since getting divorced back in September of 2020, I ended up moving into this place right around Halloween of 2020. And weird things have been happening outside of the house ever since. Weird noises, strange sounds. Sometimes I could hear this weird water dripping noise, like a large drain dripping water outside my house. Loud, squishy sounding footprints right outside my house, like something weighing 800 or 900 pounds, walking through thick, dense mud. Except there is no mud around my house. It's all just dirt and grass. But the scariest thing that happened was back in January. I had woken up right around midnight to go let my dog out. As I go towards the back door and I let him out, he begins kind of freaking out, acting weird. Definitely not normal. But he's still going out, which I'm not sure what that was about. I just thought he was being dumb. And me being half asleep did not help either. He began whimpering more and more as he slowly paced towards the creek, which is maybe 40 or 50 feet away from my back sliding door. Then, I heard the weirdest, loudest groan I had ever heard. Immediately, it reminded me of something you'd hear from a large alligator or crocodile. That same low groan that they make. And just in that moment, this large shadow rises up from the creek that had to have been easily 8 or 9 feet tall, incredibly large. And that's, to my horror, when I see it reach out for my dog. My dog starts going crazy, barking, going hysterical, which, again, is way out of his character. He's a very docile dog, and without hesitation, I reach down by the door, grab my .22, which I keep loaded at all times, since it's just me. And even though there are really no intruders, this was one exception where I needed to use it. I pick up my .22, take the safety off, and I fire 2 shots at this thing. I understand from you reading this, you might think I'm crazy, just firing at some unknown person or creature that I don't know what it is. But I'm here to tell you that based off the lighting, and based off the shadow that I saw, there was no way that this was a person, or somebody in a costume. This looked like some sort of human dinosaur alligator thing. It was incredibly large, thick, wide, tall, menacing, and terrifying, and had glowing yellow orangey eyes. But in the moment of all this happening, I wasn't thinking those thoughts. I wasn't sitting there wondering what this was. I simply just reacted to the situation. That something was going after my dog. So after firing 2 shots at this thing, which was only a measly .22, it didn't even seem like it even really reacted to it. And I know I hit it, because it stayed stationary, did not even move, It didn't even act like it flinched, and I know I hit it dead on. But as soon as I fired twice, it retracted its arm, which was almost like a slithering motion, like a snake, even though its arm was incredibly long, with long dangly claws. It then turned its entire body and head right towards me. I have never in my life, besides that moment, felt like literally pooping my pants out of fear. My dog comes running back toward me, full speed, whimpering, freaked out. So I slam the sliding glass door, lock it, close the blinds, while this thing begins to slowly pull its way and clamber out of the creek in my yard, slowly making its way towards my house. So I quickly make sure the blinds are closed, keep my 22 near me, pull my dog over to the living room, which is right next to where the sliding glass door is, and I call the police immediately. Let them know I have an intruder. So I sat there with my dog, quiet, waiting. An officer showed up within 10 minutes. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. He even went and checked out back for me. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything disruptive. Even out by the creek. Said he wasn't sure what I saw or who I saw, but they must be gone now. Said he'll stick around for another hour, just to make sure everything is at peace and the person doesn't return. He did, and then eventually drove away. Told me to let him know that if anything goes wrong, be sure to give him another call. Well, the next day, I went onto a local Facebook group and reached out to a local Bigfoot investigator. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I have no idea what it was I was dealing with. Some unknown animal that I had never seen, and I figure if anything, this person might have answers. Him and I exchanged phone numbers, and we chatted on the phone for a little while, when later that afternoon, he came over to investigate himself. I told him my experience, and he initially thought it was a Bigfoot that I was dealing with. Even though I didn't believe, after taking me a bit back further into the woods beyond the creek, where it's a little more swampy, we found a couple of footprints, or what we believed to be footprints, that looked almost like a large lizard. I didn't even know what I was looking at, but he seemed to be very freaked out. Wouldn't tell me what they were, and told me he's leaving immediately, that what I'm dealing with is far worse than any Bigfoot. I wasn't even sure what he meant by that, but he seemed very panicked, very scared. After leaving, I just left it to me and my dog being on our own, and that we'll just have to handle the situation ourselves. The next few nights were calm, and nothing came of it. But then, about a week later, we heard the noise again. That loud groaning sound. That sounds just like a loud crocodile, except this time, I had heard it moving toward my house. Luckily, I kept all my windows locked, doors locked, windows and blinds closed completely. I wasn't going to risk giving this thing the opportunity to try and get in my house. I kept my 22 near me, although I'm sure to this thing wasn't much. Probably nothing more than a tickle gun, honestly. This went on again for another few nights, and then finally, after that, it was peaceful for a while, for maybe another few couple weeks, when one night, just back in February, probably closer to the 20th, I began hearing these strange roaring noises out off in the swamps, behind the forest, behind the creek. So, in total distance, probably 300 to 400 feet beyond my house. They were incredibly loud, and sounded exactly like what you'd expect from hearing a dinosaur, or something along those lines. It sounded like some sort of extremely large reptile. I have no idea if there's any correlation between what I saw and the noises that I've been hearing on and off. I'm pretty spooked and concerned that my measly 22 is not going to be enough to properly protect myself if this thing decides to take charge and try and break into my home. Is there any weapons you would recommend? Any way to properly defend yourself that you can recommend to me? I'm currently looking to move out of this place. I don't feel like it's safe anymore. While I've been battling this decision for a little while, and while the property and everything around here is beautiful and wonderful, I just can't risk being around whatever that is. This just happened 2 weeks ago, and has left me pretty freaked out. We got a knock on our door from a gentleman who looked to be about in his early 40s, terrified, begging us, asking if he could come in, saying that there was something after him and he needed to call the police. Luckily, my husband answered the door, because nowadays I probably wouldn't have let him in. So my husband let him in, used our phone, and he called the police. This man was hysterical, and we tried to ask him what he meant by something chasing him. He said he was just a few miles down the road, when he said we're not going to believe him, but this large thing that walked on two legs, that looked like a large serpent or snake, with yellow piercing glowing eyes, began chasing after his vehicle, grappled onto the end of his vehicle, and tore part of his bumper off, hissed at him, and tried pulling his car off the road. The man, clearly terrified, ended up driving up to the first house he saw, which was ours, still believing that this thing was pursuing him. Leaving his car still running, the man leapt out of his car, ran right up to our door, in hopes this thing did not chase him and follow him. Now my husband and I were pretty freaked out. Either this man was on drugs or hallucinating, or his story turned out to be real. The man did not appear to be on drugs at all. He was very clean cut, very upper middle class, wore decent clothes. I don't mean to be a judge of character, but he did not seem like a type that would be tweaking it on drugs. My husband grabbed his handgun, and with a flashlight, slowly walked out to the man's car, shining everywhere, didn't see anything. The car was still running, the interior lights still on, and the driver's side door wide open, just as he explained, as if somebody rapidly pulled up and jumped out of the car in fear. My husband slowly worked his way towards the back of the vehicle, where it looked like some large animal ripped part of his bumper off the backside of his small car. Upon further look, it looked like something with large claws and teeth pulled it off by sheer force. This unsettled my husband greatly, and he began looking around, looking for any signs of whatever it was chasing him. There was nothing, but my husband claimed he did not feel safe being out there, like he was being watched or at any moment could be attacked. He hastily made it back into the house, called the police. Police came, they took notes, and offered to escort the man home, driving behind his vehicle. He accepted the offer, thanked us for being so kind, shook both of our hands, and left. After that, my husband and I couldn't even sleep that night, thinking what on earth just happened to us. Even though this is a couple of weeks ago, and life for the most part is back to normal, and we haven't seen anything like he described, it still makes me wonder, what on earth really happened? What lives around here that we don't know about? The story I'm about to tell you happened in the 90s, right around 1994. My husband worked in a warehouse that delivered furniture to stores, and I worked on cleaning houses. We made okay money from our jobs, but we always lived a bit of a limited life. At least we were able to keep a roof over our heads and food in the fridge. Definitely not rich by any stretch. The family that owned the warehouse my husband worked for was pretty wealthy, and what was really nice was that they had this house up in Big Bear. I cleaned it for them whenever they came back from family outings up there. Whenever that happened, we would have a family outing of our own. They would go there at least 4 times a year, so that meant we would go 4 times too. We would always plan it so that we would leave on Thursday and come back on Monday morning. The family knew we did this. It was actually their idea. We'd spend most of our time there relaxing, living it up like we could not do at home. Our daughter was young in those days, so I loved the idea of taking her out into nature, the fresh air, the trees, taking her on walks. It was nice. We enjoyed ourselves until the last day before we would leave. On that day, I'd start cleaning. One summer, I had to go clean up the house after a 4th of July party that the family had hosted. My daughter was about 4 or 5. We left at noon, got there around 7. The house was 3 stories tall. The living room and kitchen were on the 2nd floor. the bedrooms in the first and third floors. My daughter's favorite was the first, because it had a room with a trunk full of toys and games. The house was pretty secluded, with an open backyard that if you would walk far enough, you would eventually reach a lake. You could even see it from the third floor balcony. Anyway, one night, my husband went to bed early, but my daughter could not sleep. So I let her play downstairs with some of the toys. I was upstairs in the living room, watching TV. She comes running into the room, crying. I asked her what was wrong, if she was hurt, but she was scared. She said she saw something just outside the window, that a big dog growled at her. I told her not to worry, and that she probably just saw some stray animal. I asked her to show me, but she did not want to. I was surprised, to be honest. My daughter loves animals, but this really scary dog had her shook up. I kissed her, told her to head upstairs to Daddy, and I would check it out, make sure it was gone. She went upstairs, and I went downstairs. The first floor had a deck out on the back, looking over the yard. I slid open the door leading outside and turned on the lights. There was an awful smell out there, like sulfur or urine, whatever it was. It was strong and stung the back of my nose. I looked down, noticing the deck was wet, but it had not rained for days. But what really got me was what I saw on the deck. Footprints. They were like a dog's, but two things stood out to me. First was the overall shape. They had the shape of a paw, but much bigger. Longer too. And secondly, the footprints themselves. Whatever this was, it was not walking on 4 legs, but on 2. I wasn't sure in the dark, but the way they were spaced didn't look like a dog, like my daughter said. The prints went across the deck, down the steps. I went inside to grab a flashlight. I wanted to check to see if it was trying to get into the garage or the garbage cans. I followed the prints to the end of the deck and down the stairs where I saw the ground was damp, following the footsteps all the way to the front of the house, where they suddenly stopped. I stood there for a while, looking into the dark and listening. Soon, I heard a rumble above me. I shined my light towards the roof, which sloped down, near to the ground, and saw it, there, sitting on shingles. It had this face like a German shepherd, but much bigger. It was dripping water. Its ears were upright and sharp, sort of like a bat's, but thinner. The eyes were shining bright yellow, like hot embers, and it was growling at me. I couldn't see clearly and thought it might be a rabid dog. I began yelling, waving my arms around to scare it, hoping that if I pretended to be bigger, that it might just run away. Then this mangy-looking creature stood up on its 2 hind legs. It towered over me from the roof, like 3 of me put together, and it was very angry, teeth bared. With my flashlight, I was able to make out its body. It had a broad white chest, but it wasn't completely hairy. It was like it had mange, with part of its arm red, like it had been wounded. It was stripped almost entirely of hair, and the eyes, with the light on them, looked like they were glowing. At that moment, I was petrified. I thought I was in a nightmare. A demon from another world, staring right at me. It felt like I stood there, frozen for an eternity. Finally, I took a step back, but tripped and fell on my back. The flashlight fell to the ground, and I lost all visibility I had on this thing. All I could see was a silhouette from the faint moonlight. I started shuffling backwards, trying not to make any sudden moves that might agitate it, whatever it was. Then, it jumped, maybe 10 feet in the air, or more, over the top of me, landing behind me and taking off running into the forest. I scrambled up quickly, ran to the front door, and hurried inside as fast as I could, locking the door behind me. I started up the stairs, noticing my daughter coming downstairs to see me. She asked if the scary dog was gone. The whole ordeal left me sweaty, trembling. I told her, yeah, it's gone. Everything's going to be okay. From that day on, I was scared there. My wife would always ask why I was on edge when we went to Big Bear. We even had fights about it. Eventually, the arguments stopped when the family sold the house, but what happened there never left my mind. What I saw that day was the stuff of nightmares, the stuff you see in horror movies. It was a moment that felt so unreal, but real at the same time. People might say I had a misidentification, but you tell me, with everything I described to you, what other animal could it have possibly been? I know what I saw. I live in a ridiculously small town in Vermont called Jay, right alongside the Canadian border. Aside from the town having very few businesses, we are entirely overshadowed by Jay State Forest and Jay Peak. We're pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It was Christmas Day, and just me and my single mom. I'm not a child anymore. A teenager, yes, but I'm not exactly jumping up and down for Christmas to come. We knew this year would be quiet, so we just lined up a few movies to watch, made 2 steaks for dinner. In this part of Vermont, it was not uncommon to see a moose or a deer family come through from the forest past our home. The town was quieter than usual, just due to the holiday. This brought down more raccoons and bears than usual, looking for food in the cold Vermont winter. Hearing the bashing of trash cans became part of everyday life, and this Christmas was no different. We FaceTime with my sister, who is currently living in New York City. We also spoke to an aunt in California. The day was fairly ordinary, and the food was good, but again, dinner, just like any other day. We gave each other a few gifts, but even felt that was underwhelming. I was looking forward to my mom going to sleep, so I could play video games and not feel like I was ignoring her. The PlayStation was in the living room, which overlooked the road in the front of the house. On the opposite side of the road was where the forest is. The television sat in the corner next to the window, so it is hard to not see movement outside, even when you're sucked into a game. Around 11 p.m. at night, after Mom had been asleep for a while, I heard more trash cans banging around in front of the house. I had taken the trash out earlier, and the dinner scraps were in there. I figured it was a raccoon trying to get whatever was left on the bones to bring back to its family. But as I tried ignoring the noise, it just got louder, like something was digging to the bottom. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement and could tell that it was not a raccoon. Probably a bear. I thought I should look so I could make sure whatever it was. Chances were good that it would just run away if I scared it, that it would not get aggressive or try to come for the house. I told my friends that I was playing with virtually that I needed to step away because something was getting into our trash. They laughed. None of them live anywhere near as remote as us. I laughed with them because I watch animals dumpster dive all day. My laughing stopped, though, when I saw what was actually outside. Pulling aside the curtain, I could see something very human-like, bending over into the trash can. Human-like, but completely covered in fur. It was definitely not shaped like a bear. My breathing must have become heavy. One of my friends could still hear me, and began asking if I was all right. All I could say was that I needed them to hold on one more second. As if it heard me, the creature emerged from the garbage can and stared directly into the window. Its eyes were glowing, and its face was hideous. It was like a werewolf, but more man-like than dog-like. It stood on its hind legs, looked about 7 feet tall from what I could see. I could not take my eyes off it. The creature wiped its mouth, or whatever, and he was tearing through in the garbage, and continued staring at me. I couldn't think, and had forgotten that I had my friends on the headset. They were trying to get my attention, but all I could do was stand there, thinking that earlier I was seeing things or I was going to die. I noticed that the Christmas lights from the window were still on, as well as the tree. I put my controller down, reached for the plug, not taking my eyes off this thing. He looked angry, as if me looking at him disturbed his meal. He appeared as if he would pounce if I were standing outside, closer, in arm's reach. I pulled the lights out of the wall, and it appeared to startle him. He jumped a bit, knocking over the trash can and making a loud noise. I heard my mother jump out of the bed, so she must have heard it too. Just then, he took off in the direction of the forest. My mother came downstairs, staring at me silently in shock. She must have seen it too, but didn't know if I had, and did not want to scare me. My friends, who were still on the headset, trying to get my attention, I snapped out of it, told them I had to go. We both went outside to pick up the trash and the trash can. The whole time we did not say a word to each other. I don't know how much she saw, but I know that I saw a lot. I don't even like living here anymore. I've already made plans to move down to the city and go live with my sister. It's probably better than being around here where this thing lives. Hopefully, it doesn't ever get me. Wish me luck. Hi, what lurks beneath. I've been a long-time listener. Big fan of your channel. Always have been since I started listening. I don't have any personal experiences with this cryptid, but my family, being primarily in Louisiana and all around New Orleans, they have a bunch of experiences with the Honey Island swamp monster. I thought I would share several stories with you from my own family, from my brother, my father, my grandfather, even from my mom and uncle, all having their own experiences. Even though the first reported sighting was around 1963, my grandfather has seen something like this in the swamps even before then, when he was out hunting, tracking, and exploring. My grandfather's story being probably one of the most vivid. Back in the early 60s or mid-60s, before the 1963 story was first reported, or at least came out to the public, he was fishing in the swamps on a very small boat. He didn't really tell me the details of the boat's size or where he was at, just that he was in the swamps outside New Orleans when he was attacked by this 8 to 9 foot tall, hairy reptilian-looking beast. He described it as being covered in dark brown matted hair, a horrific monkey lizard face, and large claws on a 3-webbed fingered hand. He claims that had it been just an inch closer, it would have gashed him wide open, and actually tore his boat in half. He made it on a shore, and ran for his life to the nearest road, where a man just so happened to be driving by was able to pick him up and drive him off to safety. He described it as coming from out of nowhere, underneath the water, and as soon as it rose up, it was far taller than his boat, and was far uglier than anything he's ever seen. When I asked him to describe the face more, he didn't really say much, but that it kind of looked like a mix between an ape and a lizard, having a smashed up face, or so he says, with kind of yellow reptilian eyes with black slits, and 2 little cutout holes like nostrils. He didn't see any teeth that he could see, but said when it swooped his hand down, it nearly got him. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but a lot of the people from his generation, who grew up in the 40s and 50s, are pretty hardy individuals, my grandfather included. But this encounter left him shaken, terrified. He didn't end up going back into the swamps for many years after that. I think it would be almost nearly 10 years before he would even return. This also happened after my grandfather's previous experience, which I just told you about. My dad was playing with his friends out in a bayou when him and all of his friends saw this tall thing climb upon the shore on the opposite bank. The sight alone sent them all screaming, running off in opposite directions. Even my own father, he described it as being this tall, bulky man, covered in thick, nasty swamp hair, with large claws dangling from its hands and feet, climbing up out of the water. Obviously, he didn't see a face, because this thing's back was towards them, but said once it fully emerged onto shore, it went off into the dense swamp, like it was nothing, even though the swampland around there was pretty hard and thick, tough to get through. But this thing didn't seem to have any issues. Another one was when my mom was about 17 years old, still in high school, and snuck a few cigarettes from her parents. Because she was driving her dad's car, she didn't want to get caught smoking cigarettes in the vehicle. So, on her way home from her friend's house, she pulled over to the side of a road, got out of the car, and smoked, so that way there would be no residual smells in the vehicle. About halfway through the cigarette, she claims that this big, hairy man came out of the trees and tried to grab her. Scaring her almost half to death, she threw the cigarette down, got in the car, and spun away before this thing could reach through the window and grab her, as it tried to do. Her descriptions were very similar to my grandfather. Very ugly looking, leathery face, slits for a nose, yellow eyes, and large claws as it reached out for her. Her comment about its hair was also the same as my father and grandfather. Long, shaggy, thick, matted hair, covered in all sorts of awful swamp goop and debris, and carried a really bad odor along with it. She also claims to have smelt a really strong, bad odor while she was smoking her cigarette before this thing ever appeared, and just chalked it up to be the swamps around her. My uncle's experience also happened during the nighttime. Except for him, it was early morning, and out of everybody's was the more recent, happening in 1979. He was on his way to work, around 4 in the morning, when he came around a bend in the road and saw this large, what he said, pile of hair lying in the middle of the road. Thinking it was a dead animal, he stopped, got ready to get out of his car, and maybe move it, since it was lying right in the middle of the road. But as he began to slow down, this thing jolted up and shot upwards, and my uncle was shocked and terrified, realizing this was not a dead animal, but in fact a 9-foot-tall hairy man with a really ugly face and long black claws. Once it shot up, it scurried off the road into the thick swamp, never to be seen again by him or the rest of my family. His recounting of details is probably the least out of everybody else's, since he only saw glimpses of it, and it all happened so fast. Once my parents ended up finding each other, they got together, got married, and moved up here to Northern California, where they had me. Although we've all gone back to visit my family since then, I have never purposely put myself out there in the thick swamps or bayous to try and see anything myself. There are many people that live in the city and the local area that have no encounters with this thing, who don't even believe. And, well, I would tell you that you need to go out looking, because he's certainly there. Even though I haven't seen him myself, I understand that that's his territory, and that it's probably not wise for myself to go out there, putting myself in harm's way like that. If you ever decide to visit the area, take interest in all the local sites, food, and amazing culture the city has to offer. But if you decide to venture out in the swamplands or even the bayous, just be careful. Watch over your shoulder, because you never know when this thing might be lurking around the area. Ever since I was just a boy, I had always grown up hearing about the legend of the Honey Island swamp monster, although I never was a believer until one day when I was about 14, along with some friends, playing, fishing on a summer day along the Old Pearl River. It was a beautiful hot day out, and my friends and I were jumping in to cool off. The entire time we were there, we could smell this awful stench, and we're used to the marshes and the smell that comes with it. But this was something else entirely. Like you took that smell, added in rotting meat, skunk, and sulfur, and took it up to level 10, and it lingered really badly. We thought it to be a dead animal rotting nearby, somewhere, so we ignored it for the most part. We were probably there for another hour before things around us began to get silent. My friend's the one who noticed it and told all of us to be quiet and to listen. It was so quiet that you could hear the faintest sound. It certainly made all of our hairs stand on end, and we were all a little bit uneasy. But, being 14 and 15, we weren't about to allow that to ruin our fun. So we just ignored it, kept playing in the river, and doing what 14 and 15-year-olds do. When, out of the corner of my eye, I see this large figure emerge from the trees in the thicket to my left. We all screamed as we saw it. It came toward us, very quickly, picking up the pace. I had never seen Bigfoot before, but that's what this thing looked like. Incredibly hairy. I couldn't really see the face very well. It was obscured by a lot of hair and other debris that was all over its body. But I'll never forget the long claws that drug from its body, from its incredibly large hands. My two friends dove out of the river onto the shoreline and began running as fast as they could into the forest, even though our bikes and where we came from was the complete opposite direction. This thing continued toward us when I finally turned around as it became more and more near and ran off in the direction that we came from, half panicking that this thing was after us, and half panicking that, oh great, now my friends are now lost in the woods, alone with whatever this thing was. After grabbing my bike and going a little bit out of view, I stopped and thought to myself, I gotta go back and rescue my friends. So I turned around on my bike and drove back, which was only about 30 seconds away, till the river came back in view. This thing wasn't anywhere near around, and I didn't fully realize at the time that that was indeed the Honey Island swamp monster. So, I jumped out, swam across the river, jumped up on the other side, and began shouting for my friends, telling them, come on, we got to get out of here. Luckily, they didn't go very far into the woods, only a little bit, as to hide from whatever that thing was. We all regrouped very quickly, jumped over and ran to the other side, got our bikes and fled out of there, not even taking a moment to discuss what it was that came after us, or what it could have been. I don't think any of us really cared, just that we wanted to get out of there now, and we had no desire to go back to that spot. It's sad. That was one of our favorite swimming spots. Had been for years, but after that day, I'm pretty sure that we all became believers very quickly, and that legend soon turned into a reality for all of us. Now, fast forward to the following summer, all of us were still pretty sketched out to go back to that spot. Being teenage boys, there was still no talk about it being the Honey Island swamp monster. I think we realized what it was. It's just nobody wanted to bring that name up. I think we were so scared to put truth to the reality that that's what it really was. I believed. I'm sure they did too. We had tried several other different spots along the river, staying far away as from that one spot as we could. And sometimes, I swear we could still smell that awful smell, which would put us on very high alert. But we never did see or have an experience like we did that one day in July. Since graduating high school, growing up, I lost contact with that circle of friends, so I don't know what any of them are up to anymore. I moved to the East Coast, have a family now, and my own life. But if there's anything I've learned from that whole experience, is that the so-called folklore or legends oftentimes probably have more truth to them than we would like to believe. There's a reason they started, probably more than just somebody mistaking the identity of an animal or coming up with some campfire story. In our case, that truth to us was made known in a very scary way. I don't know if this is exactly a weird creature sighting, but I'm sure you'll find it interesting. Between the ages of 6 and 10, I used to go stay with my grandmother on the weekends on my father's side. She passed away shortly before I turned 13, and I stopped going there around age 10 because we moved out of state, so contact with her became much more minimal, even though her and I were very close for those 4 years. She did a lot with me, and we did a lot on the weekends. I was never one kid to just sit and watch TV all day at my grandma's house. We were always doing activities, chores, playing in the garden together, helping her do stuff. You know, very good grandmother-grandson activity time. One time, it was nearing fall. I'll never forget this, because it scared me so badly. But I never saw it after this, so who knows. Anyway, I'm lying in bed, getting ready to shut my eyes. I should also make note that her basement had been completely converted into a little bedroom for me. You go downstairs, and directly to the right is a bedroom. Very nicely put, very well decorated. It wasn't slummy or nasty at all. Very nice. Then, when you go out the door, directly facing you was the laundry room, and if you were instead to turn to your left, instead of going straight ahead of you to the laundry room, you'd go right up the stairs up into the kitchen. So naturally, in my bedroom, you had one of those high-up-on-the-wall windows, kind of like you have on any basement. They're very small, rectangular. You can't see out them that great, but they do allow light to come in. It was probably anywhere between 8 and 10 p.m., and I was laying there in bed. I still had my lamp on, because I think I wasn't settled down quite yet. And I just got this feeling that someone was looking at me. So I naturally turned to look toward the window, and that's when I screamed out loud, because I saw this really hideous face pressed up against the glass of the window, staring at me. I can tell you one thing. I don't think it was a person, but I really don't know what it was. It was pale, had really sharp bony features, and very sunken-in eyes. There was no glow to their eyes, like many of these creepypasta fake stories. They were kind of just black. Obviously, it wasn't like the paranormal, where they're just two sunken-in black holes with no eyes. I think its eyes were just dark. And like a lot of paranormal stories, it did not have a big gaping black hole for a mouth. It was closed, so I didn't see any teeth, but its lips were very sunken in, and I couldn't see if it had hair or not. But it had its face clearly pressed up against the glass, as if it had been observing me from some time. As soon as I saw it and began screaming, it very calmly pulled away from the glass and disappeared. I ran upstairs, told my grandmother, who was still getting ready for bed at this time, and had not yet laid down. She was a little alarmed, but assured me that I probably just fell asleep and had a nightmare. But I was pretty adamant about my point, and that saying there's somebody outside the house. She went and looked herself, not seeing anything. My grandma, surprisingly, wasn't afraid of much, so she didn't even bring a weapon with her. She just figured if there was somebody out there, she would call the police. So she scouted around the house for me. Didn't see anything, no traces of anybody. The neighborhood that she lived in was rather small, but not like we were out in the boonies at all. And it's not like we were in a thick suburban neighborhood full of houses. It was kind of an old retirement community. Everybody kept to themselves, and after about 6 p.m., it died down a lot, got really quiet. There weren't really any other kids to play with either. I do remember that. Anyway, after seeing that face, nothing else became of it, and it would be several more years I would stay at her house every other weekend, or every weekend, depending on the month, and I never did see it again. But sometimes, especially now as I'm writing this, I wonder if it did come back and watch me as I slept, or maybe I just didn't notice it. I still wonder what it could have been. This happened in Sweden. I was 11 at the time. Me and my family was camping in a trailer, standing in a forest, with a river behind a hill. One night, at around 10:30, I heard a sound, just behind the trailer in the distance, close to the small river right behind our trailer. I placed myself at the end of the bed to get a closer look at the direction from where I had heard this sound. That's when I saw it. It was large. Not large enough to be a bobcat, but neither was it large enough to be a wolf. It was strolling on all fours in a straight line by the hill and the foreside, and even when the distance was about 30 to 50 meters, it stopped and slowly turned its head. That's when I realized that it knew somehow that it had been spotted. We lock eyes, and I see a pair of yellow glowing round spots just staring at me. It lasted for a whole 5 minutes. Then, it just gets these spasms or something, and runs off into the forest. To this day, I have no idea what it was. But later on, I found out that we were camping in a place very close to a witch's burial ground. Apparently, an actual witch had been executed close to where we were camping. Before she was decapitated, she said this: "Where my head falls, there shall grow a large tree." And apparently, exactly where her head landed, a huge tree grew. Normally, I don't do this kind of thing. I work for a pretty small production company that shoots commercials, music videos, and this time, last year, before COVID-19, I was outside of LA scouting potential filming locations for a client when, believe me when I say this, I saw a coyote stand up on 2 legs and begin to walk toward me. Frightened, I got back in my vehicle and drove off to a different area entirely. If you don't know much about the geography of outside LA, it's pretty much desert. There's rattlesnakes, coyotes. These things are common, but what's not common is to see a coyote stand up on 2 legs, just like a person, and come towards you. Due to my profession, I don't really tell people openly about this. In fact, I think you're really the only person that I've ever written this in and sent it to, just for hopes. Growing up out here, you do sometimes hear stories about Native American magic and witches and stuff like that, but I never really gave it much thought. Always just thought they were nothing more than campfire stories. But after seeing what I did, well, maybe there's something to it. I'm not saying that's what it was. Sorry this email is so short, but it was just very strange, and I was wondering if you've ever heard or seen of anything like this happening. Before I even go on to my story, I don't want to scare you away. The Gallatin National Forest is breathtaking, as well as much of the state of Montana is. It's one of my favorite states to hike, explore, just because it has so much to offer. While it doesn't necessarily have the beaches that the coasts do, it offers its own unique beauty. Anyway, I was hiking a very common trail. It's called the Middle Cottonwood Trailhead, and is beautiful, as much of the state of Montana is, offering a large variety of sights and sounds all around you. It was on this day that I saw a creature that I cannot identify. I saw it from a distance, jumping out of the trees and walking down a slope down the hill, then disappearing by going into the tree line. I was the only one around at the time, so there were no other witnesses with me. This happened at about 2 p.m., broad daylight, only a couple clouds in the sky, very clear weather. No really shadows or objects obstructing my field of view. The creature moved kind of like a large cat, but from what I could see, almost had the body kind of like that of a hyena. At least the back reminded me of it. Had very disproportionately long forearms and back legs, with large hands and claws at the end, and the head appeared to be rather large and round, with what seemed like a very flat face, almost like a person, except no nose or snout protruding from it. Due to the poor angle that I was at, and the way this unknown creature was facing me, I didn't get a good look at its face, or any much of the features of the head, but it did appear to have small ears at the top, and it did have a very long tail. If I had to summarize it, take a black panther and a hyena, fuse them into one, and give it the head of almost kind of a light bulb shape, but then shrink it down and make it black, with kind of tall ears at the top. The creature was dark in color. I wouldn't say exactly pitch black, because it appeared to be maybe more of a smoky color or dark brown, and just like a hyena, kind of had a trail of tuft of hair going down its back that was much more of a visible gray color, and a long tail, kind of like a feline, but more slender, kind of like a dog. Its movements were also equally strange, since it did not match the description of a large cat, nor did it match the description of a dog or any other sort of animal I've ever seen. It's actually hard for me to try and accurately portray its movements, because even though it kind of crouched, it acted more like an animal on the move, and not exactly as delicate or agile as a feline would be, and not as rough and careless as a canine. After it disappeared into the tree line, I sat there, waiting for it, hoping it would reemerge so I could get a better look. I even pulled out my phone and zoomed in to see if I could see anything. But after waiting there for about another minute, nothing happened. So I put my phone down and decided to sit down and look out into the small little valley. Nothing. Nothing came of it. It never reemerged. About 20 minutes goes by, and a couple of hikers walk by. I asked them a couple questions, seeing if they've seen any strange animals they've ever seen before. They both gave me puzzled looks, and said no. They went on their way. I was determined to find out what it was, but I found little to no hope of actually finding answers. The day went on, and my hike ended. After going back home, I even tried to do some research online as to what it could possibly be. I have seen everything from bears to mountain lions to big cats, but you don't understand. The description of what I saw, it doesn't match any of those things, and I got a pretty good look at it, since it took its time going down from the tree, going across the small hill to the other side of the tree line, never looking up at me, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I guess it could have been a chimera of sorts, a mixed hybrid of animals. That's what it appeared to be from a distance. I mean, if you think about it, when you see a cougar from a distance, it generally looks like a cougar. If you see a coyote, a wolf, or a bear from a distance, you can generally make it out to be exactly that. This thing was no more than 70 meters away from me, so it wasn't like it was obstructed or hard to see. It was just so strange that I'd never seen it before. I guess Montana is big enough to house a species of unknown animals if it really wanted to. Maybe that's what I saw. Maybe there are other people who visit that state and area that might be able to know. Perhaps I should try reaching out to more people in that area, maybe finding out more. I tried talking to more people, like the park rangers and stuff, but they had no idea what I was talking about. I'd even tried talking to more hikers who frequented that area. You'd be surprised by how many of the same people you see walking some of the same trailheads that just enjoy the scenic view. Same thing. So there's no way I can be the only one to have seen this thing. Maybe there's more of us.